by the Supreme Court's decision. The plaintiffs were accusing Harvard of discriminating against Asian American applicants in particular by using really kind of subjective measures of sort of individual, personal types of traits. Their allegation was that Harvard was using those kind of soft traits to basically put a cap on how many Asians they might admit from year to year. So it's a very tiny piece, in a way, of affirmative action in a broader sense, right?
I think it would be good to back up a little bit and look at, okay, who's behind the case, right? Abigail Fisher. This is a person who did not get into University of Texas and essentially said, I didn't get in because of race. And kind of the implication is that basically they're letting black and brown students in. That ended up getting rejected. Didn't work.
Which, isn't it crazy considering that, like, I'm pretty sure affirmative action has helped white women more than any other group. And it's not close.
But then what happened is there's a essentially conservative legal activist named Edward Bloom who has kind of made a career out of picking up cases that align with things that he wants to push forward politically, and he'll find somebody that kind of matches up with this.
It's like he found a good match, because in the Texas case that you mentioned, that Abigail Fisher, she was a young white woman, right? So then I think at that time, because they lost at the Supreme Court, they kind of pivoted and thought, if we could get like the right people of color to sort of front the case, or to be the face of the case, then we might have, that is Blum and his operation might have better odds.
Students for Fair Admissions, which is the group in question here, they put up a website called harvardnotfair.org and started seeking people to say, hey, do you have a complaint? Would you like to complain? And of course, look at the front, Asian face slapped on the front, and basically it says, hey, did you not get into Harvard? Do you think it's because of race? Send us an email. What we're about to watch is this is Kenny Xu, who's on the board of Students for Fair Admissions.
The left's narrative is that if you are a white person, you're privileged, or if you're a person of color, you're oppressed. But Asian Americans inconvenience that narrative because although they're a person of color and they have experienced racism and discrimination in this country, I think the recent wave of anti-Asian attacks prove that to be completely true. They have experienced racism. They still perform at a level that is comparable to whites and even higher than whites. They inconvenience the narrative of the left because even though they're supposed to be oppressed and supposed to play victims, they actually, because of their...
Dude, what a fucking dweeb, dude. I want to give this guy a fucking wedgie, man. Oh my fucking God, dude. The left doesn't think because you are of a certain race that you are dealing with, like, incapable levels of oppression. No one's ever said that. People have just said, hey, this is, I feel like, I want to go back for just 2 seconds. I feel like there's this dichotomy or this like false narrative, I guess, that gets spread that the left thinks everyone is oppressed and we need to fix this, the systems that allowed this to happen. And the right thinks that you need to bootstrap. But the reality is more that the right thinks that you need to bootstrap. And the left thinks, yeah, there are lots of things that you can do individually that can improve your life, like going to therapy, getting a psychiatrist, working hard to do well in school. Like, just statistically speaking, if you have a higher education, you make more money. I'm pretty sure even in the medians and the average, median is, yeah. And the average are both like higher if you have higher education. Like people with high school degrees just on average tend to make more than people without high school degrees. So like the left will tell you that there are things that you should do to improve your personal standing in society, but also doesn't mean that you ignore all of the other things, right? You can recognize that there are systems in place meant to keep certain people down. and also try your best to work around the system. You know?
Their culture and because of their educational skills and traits are able to achieve a modicum of middle-class success in this country.
Yes, that right there. Notice the things that he says because of culture. Like our culture, because of our cultural values, we have this success, right? And that's why. It's because of culture. And then, okay, the question then becomes, well, okay, is there somebody else who doesn't have these cultural values and they're not successful? And of course, the answer is Black people don't.
A lot of the folks who are really invested in dismantling of call it race-based admissions, you know, they're more recent immigrants that have been able to come to the United States because the U.S. revised its immigration policies in the 60s and let Asians in. And also because of civil rights movement, Black freedom movement, other kinds of reforms put into place. If we have like a big takeaway from this history and then this current affirmative action issue, really it's about how the history of Black Americans and Asian Americans are so deeply interconnected. And we really can't understand one group's history without taking into account the other. There's like a very common kind of phrase that we hear a lot associated with Asian Americans. That's the so-called model minority myth or model minority stereotype. And I'm sure everybody in chat like totally would know, even if they don't know that phrase. It's just the stereotype that Asians are a certain kind of like good minority, you know, like they work hard, they're smart, they're pretty quiet, they don't rock the boat, and they're fairly successful. They're, you know, they kind of...
I know that this video is about specifically affirmative action and race. However, God, I feel so fucking bad for Asian women trying to date, because the number of people that have told me that their experience dating people as someone who's Asian is just like the worst thing on the planet. It's just fucking terrible, because you just have no idea if the person you're going on a date with is fetishizing like Asian culture and is like, oh, I want a nice submissive wife, so I'm gonna get an Asian wife. And it's like, what the what the fuck, dude? Christ, oh my God, Jesus. Race fetishists ruin everything. Yeah, Americans know nothing about Asian culture and geography in general too. Oh yeah, God, you wouldn't have Wu-Tang without interchange of Black and Asian culture. Very good point. Yeah, very, very good point. I know people who work in admissions in Ivy League schools. They admit people based on how likely the student or family will be would to donate to the institution throughout their lifetimes. It's a business. It is a business. It's always been a business. So yeah, I do feel bad for... Where are you from, China? Yeah. God. What did this chatter mean by this? What did this... What? Oh no. Where are you really from, energy? No, but where are you really from? Where are you from?
Encapsulate that American dream of immigrants, you know, working their way up the ladder and achieving that American dream. But that...
What's the difference between fetishizing and just thinking Asian chicks are hot? The primary difference is that if you think Asian women are hot, first of all, you would be based, because they are. Versus fetishizing, which is like, I only want to date Asian women, and I only want to date Asian women because Asian women are culturally submissive. That would be fetishizing. But if you're just like, dude, Asian women are hot, that's not fetishizing. That's like, or in my opinion, that's not fetishizing. Like, if you just think certain groups are attractive, that's fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. But it's like, I only want an Asian waifu. Like, now we're in weird territory. Now or like I only want an Asian wife. That's it. I don't want any other kind of wife. I don't want any other race. It's like, ooh, that's a little, if you're not of that racial group, it's a little weird, because it's less weird if you're part of the racial group, because if you're part of the racial group, you are going to be inclined to wanting someone of a similar background, just because it's going to be someone that you get along with better. And it's going to be someone who probably shares similar cultural values, knows what it's like to have a certain type of family or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, that's just generally pretty, like, normal, I think. Like, I've seen, what is it called? Like, oh, there was this, we'll not get into it too hard, but there was this video that was making the rounds, and it was basically about this like clip from, I think, Scrubs, where I guess like the black character was saying that he wants to marry a black woman, and people were like, oh, reverse the roles and this would be racist. And it's like, okay, but the primary difference here is that if, let's say you're black and you have a black family, there are certain aspects of your culture, or there are certain aspects, not even of culture, but like your experience as someone who's black in America is just going to be so different than someone who's white. You know?
My Mexican friends have told me I'm the whitest Mexican they've ever met, lol. A big reason is cause I prefer American tacos over actual Mexican ones.
That's big. And so like, you might want to date someone, if you are black and you're making a preference to want to date someone that's similar to you, you're making that preference because it's like, I don't want to deal with people who tell me that like police brutality isn't real. I just don't want to. I don't want to deal with their family being racist. Like, I don't want to deal with that. You know, I want to be with someone who already gets it, who understands everything, who I don't feel like I have to handhold them at all. You know what I mean? So like, that makes sense. But when you're not of a certain culture and then you're fetishizing a certain culture and you're like, oh, I would love to have that. It's like, that's weird. That's weird. I'm trans and I only date trans people. It's the same thing. Oh, and I've heard like a lot about this also. I think ContraPoints had a video where she talked about it as well. That like trans people, especially earlier in transitioning and even later sometimes as well, it's like, I don't want to deal with teaching a cis person what it means to be trans. I just don't. It's just the emotional labor that I would have to expend is too much for me. And so I just don't want to seek that out. Versus being someone who's cis and only being into trans women. It's like, giving me chaser vibe. It also happens to Eastern European women. I literally saw this yesterday. Hold up, let me open this up. I don't know whose chat this is. It's not my chat, but motherfucking Space Cobbler says, do you have a boyfriend? We can't go to Ukraine. I think your country has the most beautiful women in the world, though. True, but they are more common in Ukraine, and they seem to want more sensible men. In the UK, the women are not mature before 25. Lol. That's not... I really tried to come up with something positive about that, and I couldn't find anything. I mean, like, UK women are different, but that's because they say gash instead of pussy, which we all agree. Like, if you say gash during sex, like, dude, what the fuck is wrong with you? Oh my God. Like, you are sick. So, like, I think that's a valid reason to not want to date UK women. You know what I mean? I think that's pretty valid. They say minge too. Ugh. No. Put in my gash. Gobble. Oh my gosh. Serving gash. The whole red pill community promotes women, getting women from other countries who are more traditional. It's sad that people are so scared of women having autonomy. Yeah. Yeah. I don't mind Fanny. Fanny's fine. I think it's fine. But like Gash, it's not good. It's not good. No, it's just not. No. Fanny is just kind of silly. It just sounds a little silly. Oh, God. God damn. Okay, sorry. Back to the video.
Intersects also with, the fact that they're also like people of color or minorities, and so that particular mythology of about Asian Americans really came out. It was a really recent invention from like the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Before that, Asians were completely despised. In fact, ordinary Americans and policymakers just wanted to really banish them or exclude them, completely shut them out from the United States.
There were laws for this, yeah. Like you
absolutely
can't not come in, yeah.
You can't come in. You can't become a naturalized citizen. You can't marry white folks. You can't own property. Shut out of lots of different, hundreds of different kinds of jobs. And so it's pretty grim. It's kind of like the.
I mean, this is basically what the U.S. has done to every single minority at some point. Like Chinese Exclusion Act, making sure that people that are of some Asian descent have to live in certain neighborhoods. They're not allowed to live outside of those neighborhoods. I mean, what does that sound like? That sounds like redlining in black neighborhoods, right? That's not even talking about like the internment camps that we had for Japanese people. That's not even talking about how much Chinese labor we abused for building our railroads that we fucking threw out because the car industry. Like, we abused the fuck out of Asian labor, and we being America, very racist, very fucking racist. It's been only pretty recently that like a lot of those stereotypes have like died down, and now we have Kung flu virus and immediately pulling anyone from the street that looks remotely Asian and saying, go back to China. And it's like, I'm Korean. What? Huh? What the fuck, dude? What the fuck? Killed the natives, enslaved other humans, etc. Yeah. We put Jews in camps after World War II. Look up Oswego, New York. Yeah, I mean, I fucking believe it, dude. I mean, there was a point where we were unironically racist towards Italians and Irish people. Like nowadays, there's basically no such thing as anti-Italian sentiment, just because Italians have now been put under the umbrella of being white in the US. But prior to that, like there was there was. Same thing with the Irish people. Frito, LOL, yeah. Yeah. All right.
West Coast cousin of Jim Crow, in California and Oregon and Washington and so forth. And so things were pretty tough for Asian immigrants, really until that 1940s World War II tipping point. And so in that really kind of this moment of great upheaval in American society, the racial order kind of gets reshuffled. The U.S. is aspiring to become this global leader. It's fighting these wars in the name of freedom and democracy. And so racism, racial segregation looks kind of like bad for the brand. And so in this moment, this new story about Asian Americans emerges as, again, being these kind of hard workers, good Americans, loyal, patriotic. And then by the 1960s, as the Black freedom movement is really heating up, and it becomes very clear, even after the passage of like the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act in 1964-65, that those laws alone will not solve this really troubling and deep-rooted problem of racial discrimination against Black people. And that's where the model minority kind of story then kind of really takes off, because then it becomes a way for people to say, liberals to say, we can look to Asians as like a potential model of a solution for solving the problems of anti-Black racism, or conservatives sort of jump on the bandwagon and kind of redirect it to say, Black people, they should, they should just take the lessons. Like they should learn from Asians. Why are you making all this noise and making these demands on the government? The problem is you. The problem is not us.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. These were conversations that are happening in the 50s and 60s, which is clearly there's not an issue of racism or discrimination here, because we have a minority that is doing just fine. Big square quotes on the just fine.
Yeah.
And so what are you complaining about? All of you other groups, why don't you just go be more like them?
Exactly. If we backtrack to World War II, Black Americans at the time had a campaign they called like a double V campaign. So they wanted victory abroad and victory at home. This idea of fair employment that is like to open up that opportunity pipeline for Black workers in industry really takes hold. These different agencies in the executive branch, including some Asian American staff members, they start to formulate the early beginnings of affirmative action policy. And so it really begins with trying to open up opportunities for employment. And I think that's what we lose sometimes, and fixating on like admissions to Harvard, that really just affects such a tiny percentage of Americans, right? But the stakes are so much bigger in terms of, employment and sort of other kinds of opportunities.
This discussion's happening in chat, and I think it's important. We'd be remiss not to bring it up, and I'd love for you to dive into this, Ellen. The idea of a monolith, right? What does that mean? Like, how does that affect this? How are people using those words to really push a narrative, right?
Yeah, I mean, also, oh, God. The number of like horror stories that I've heard from Asian students or like friends of mine who are Asian, who've had to deal with like growing up as the model minority, say that they fucking hate it because the bare minimum is that you perform very well. And you have to perform very well in like basically schooling. And so when you don't, you are like, you aren't just like another average person. You are like a failure to your race or, minority or whatever. And it's fucked up. Also, it's just another way for like, let me be careful with my wording here. I feel like the model minority myth is just another way to say that this is just a bootstraps problem. That other races that are not performing well, the reason that they're not is because they just aren't working hard enough. Instead of, and just they completely ignore all of the reasons why this is wrong. You know what I mean? Dude on the top right looks like a picture for the Expos in the 70s. Dude, I'm glad mustaches have made it. I love mustaches. I think visually a mustache, if you can get a nice mustache, I think it's based. Bionic Broccoli, thank you for the 11 months. Thank you. That pressure comes from both one's own community and from like white supremacist superstructures that need the model minority as a case for the argument. Yep. I could see it being turned into a dog whistle for like racism isn't real. Oh, 100%. And it is. It 100% is. It's why conservatives are very big on the boat of, see, Asians are such good minorities. Maybe all of you other people should be like them, which is just, we don't want to actually fix the reasons or the things that impact Black communities. We just want you guys to stop complaining. Yeah, we could try to fix, police brutality, redlining, gerrymandering. We could do some of this stuff. Or, hear me out, what if we didn't? What if we didn't do that, It's also just like a eugenics argument as well. Oh yeah, 1,000,000%. 1,000,000%. How about instead of mustaches, you focus on those with normal sized head to shoulder ratio? Oh God. I think Adam Ruins Everything made a pretty good video on this. Really? Let me look for it.
Okay. Yeah. So a monolith is sort of like, so putting everybody in the same bucket, right? And assuming everybody in the bucket is like, is exactly the same or pretty close. And so I think one of the, again, kind of unintended or ironic outcomes of civil rights policy and affirmative action policy is that groups have to be put in certain sort of buckets, based on racial identity.
I found it.
And that was because in order to kind of prove and track and correct racial discrimination, there had to be, you have to kind of document it and then be able to kind of count it and sort of fix it. And so, before, in the 1960s, there was a small movement of we would call them today Asian Americans, Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino Americans, who came together, called themselves really, in a lot of ways, for the very first time as Asian Americans, and soon included other folks like Samoans, Chamorros, Southeast Asians, but they started to call themselves Asian Americans. And at that time, it was a very intentional sort of political identity. It was, they had a very anti-racist worldview, and they were actually anti-imperialist. They were the two inspirations for the Asian American movement of the 60s and 70s were Black Power and the anti-war movement, like anti-Vietnam, Southeast Asian wars. And that, because of this kind of emerging affirmative action policies in federal government, and then later like in corporations and universities, they start to organize themselves as Asian Americans and really push for, affirmative action for Asian Americans, resources for Asian Americans, et cetera, et cetera. Their numbers were very small then, so I think strategically coming together as Asian Americans in one kind of monolithic label made sense because there were just so few of them. But the population has exploded since the 1960s and the 70s, and it's like super diverse today. It's over 20 million people, and it's diverse in every way that you could think, not just socioeconomically or culturally, but ideologically, as we've seen. People have many different kinds of political positions.
And another thing that people are talking about in chat also is class is huge in this, right? And I think there's this whole series of questions that I think this ruling ends up, it's not quite addressing them, I don't think, because, we're talking about Harvard. People who are elite, who go to the elite institution to create more elite carbon copies of themselves for the most part. Like a few more people of a certain background going to Harvard, a few less people going to Harvard. Is that going to make America a good place to live? Is that going to improve the lives of most Americans? I think probably not, but it seems like we're so hyper-focused on that, right?
I think it's regrettable in a lot of ways that really what we need to expend our energy on is a much broader sort of, frame of these big questions of fairness, equality, and opportunity, and how it will have the widest reaching impact. I mean, if you're applying to Harvard, even if you don't get in, I'm pretty sure you'll be getting into some other fancy school, so that's not going to be a problem.
Yeah.
It's a self-selecting group. But, there are lots of Asian Americans who go to community colleges, and lots of Americans of all races for that matter. Our public schools certainly, need to be better funded, and our teachers better paid. I think
it's also like the model minority shit. It erases a lot of different groups. I found some Pew Research data on it. So, for example, actually, I'll just pull up the original link. Let me just close some of this other stuff. Wait, was I done with that? I'll just copy this link. For example, this is a chart on Asian Americans with a bachelor degree or more education. And so all Asians in the US have about 54% of them have a bachelor's degree or higher, right? But that doesn't take into account the areas where this isn't true, but these people are still treated as model minorities, right? So they get all of the pressure and also all of the stigma for not performing and none of the help, which is super fucked, right? So like Indians in the US, 75% bachelor's degree or higher education than that. And honestly, I believe it because very strict, very, very strict. honestly, if you have like Arab parents or like South Asian parents, they are so strict about school. They are so strict. Malaysia, 65%, Korean, Pakistani, and Chinese, 57%. Japanese are at 52%, Filipinos at 48%, Nepalese are at 44%, Vietnamese are at 32%, Hmong and Burmese 23%, Laotian is 18%, and Bhutanese is 15%. That is a huge difference. It is crazy to say, oh, well, 54% of Asian Americans have a bachelor's degree. And you're ignoring the fact that there are people here that are like sub 20%. And then there are groups that are like 75%, right? Also, Americans always forget that Indians are Asian as well. Yep. Yeah. And then even like this, for example, like poverty rates. Median household income varies widely among Asian origin groups in the US. Shocking. What a shocking concept. So like, for example, the people who live in poverty, the share of people who live in poverty, only 6% of Indian Americans live in poverty, according to Pew Research from 2019. Obviously, things could have changed after the pandemic. We need to get new information. Versus Mongolians, 25% live in poverty. Like, that's a huge difference, you know? And to just lump all those people in one group, I don't know, man. I don't know. I think immigrant parents also in general are really strict. Oh, 100%. Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to the video. Or sorry, not back to the video. Yeah, this video. Yes, and we can finish
Our energies ought to be more focused on these sort of more, I think, in a way that is more democratic and equitable, the kinds of education policies that would, again, widen that opportunity pipeline for the most people.
That's actually a really good question. Who wins here? If the argument was that Asian Americans are being discriminated against, you know, at Harvard specifically, right? We're talking about this specific case. Well, if that was happening and that is being removed, then do Asian Americans win here?
I personally do not think this is a victory for Asian Americans. I think it's like the opposite, actually, because I think it's really undermined a lot of important, you know, really decades of coalition work that Asian Americans have put in a lot of effort into supporting, you know, kind of working with other communities of color and to build a stronger democracy, you know, and a more welcoming society where everybody actually feels like they belong and have a shot at the good life. It's a setback for Asian Americans, but the silver lining for me is that it in some ways really shows, in some ways it goes against the model minority myth, because part of the model minority myth is all about how Asians keep quiet and they put their heads down, they don't engage. But what we have actually
Which is a surprise that people in power are going to idolize people who shut the fuck up and don't ask for better conditions.
Is Asian Americans, you know, investing and mobilizing on both sides of the affirmative action debate.
Sure,
and really just sort of as political actors. So it does show us that, you know, Asian Americans are not like apolitical, but that actually we care deeply, not only about education. It's not just getting into Harvard, but it's like, you know, climate change, it's healthcare, it's the whole gamut of things. And I really hope that other people will understand that Asian Americans, that we do care about this country. We are politically sort of active, you know, and it's we're a community that has a lot of potential if we can kind of harness it for the greater good.
That was a really good video. That was a really good interview. Okay. Now, guys, I've got some other stuff to show you. Before we get into the Jesse Waters segment, and before we get into the Disney segment, I had some variety content that I wanted to share with you guys, okay?